To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
When a pattern emerges in criminal investigations, it often becomes the strongest lead. In Southern California, that pattern pointed to a serial sexual offender who used a knife to control his victims and left DNA behind at multiple scenes. For years, the DNA sat unmatched. Today's episode examines the San Diego Knifepoint Rapist case, the forensic evidence that connected the assaults, and how modern forensic testing transformed a cold case into a solved one. This is Forensic Tales, episode 317, The Knifepoint Rapist. In the summer of 1995, San Diego, California, felt predictably calm. This was a city defined by sunshine and routine, beaches crowded with tourists, and quiet residential neighborhoods. It was a place where people felt comfortable going about their daily lives without much fear of what might be around the corner. Crime, of course, happened, as it does in any other big city. Some people even considered San Diego the safest big city in the country. But violent, predatory attacks, especially serial sexual assaults, weren't something most residents believed they needed to actively worry about. San Diego just didn't carry that reputation. For many people, summer nights meant open windows, unlocked gates, walks and jogs taken without a second thought. And that sense of normalcy is part of what made what happened next so unexpected. Because beginning in the mid-1990s, investigators would start to notice a pattern, one that didn't fit with how this city saw itself, a series of attacks that felt out of place, deliberate, targeted, and connected. This wasn't the kind of crime San Diego expected, and for a long time, it wasn't the kind of crime anyone knew how to stop. The first known attack occurred in August of 1995 in the Claremont Mesa area of San Diego. This is a centrally located part of the city that was known for its diverse communities and close proximity to the beach and downtown area. The victim, identified publicly as Jane Doe 1, had gone out jogging, something she'd likely done countless times before. She didn't have anything to worry about. The neighborhood was familiar. The route was familiar. Nothing about that jog suggested she had any reason to worry. At some point during her run, she stepped slightly off the main path toward a more shrub-covered area, and that's when the attacker appeared out of nowhere. According to San Diego investigators, a man suddenly jumped out from the bushes, catching her completely off guard. You can only imagine how scary that moment must have felt for this woman. He was described as having a large, muscular build, wearing a ski mask and gloves, and holding what appeared to be a large kitchen knife. The surprise alone must have been totally and completely overwhelming. She later told police she was immediately terrified, convinced she was going to die. She went out for her usual jog. And now she thinks this is going to be her last day on Earth. As a female runner myself, this has to be one of my worst nightmares. The attacker then ordered her off the path and into a more secluded area. At knife point, she was sexually assaulted by this person. Later, investigators would describe her actions during the assault as pure survival. She complied because she believed that resisting would get her killed. So there was no attempt to fight back, not because she didn't want to, but because she was doing what she needed to do to stay alive. And because she did everything this man asked her, that might be the reason why she survived this entire thing. When it was over, she somehow made her way home. She lived with her father, and together they immediately called police. She told the dispatcher she had just been raped at knife point by a stranger. Officers from the San Diego Police Department were assigned the case and met with Jane Doe one at her house. In their reports, they described her as catatonic. She had been crying, but beyond that, she appeared frozen, still in a state of complete shock. I don't think she could even comprehend exactly what had happened to her yet. It must have taken a while for everything to finally set in. But miraculously, despite her condition, despite what she had just been through, she was able to guide officers back to the location of the assault. Investigators secured the area and began what one detective later described as good old-fashioned police work. They searched the scene up and down, left and right, looking for anything the attacker might have left behind. Footprints, fibers, a dropped item, anything at all. But the scene itself didn't have much when it came to physical evidence. That didn't mean all was lost. What investigators were able to do was collect biological evidence from the victim. As is standard in sexual assault cases, officers documented everything they possibly could. A sexual assault kit was completed. Any possible trace evidence, DNA, fingerprints, or material transferred during the attack was all collected and preserved. At the time, there was no way of knowing how important that evidence would eventually become. And it wouldn't be the last time San Diego police would collect DNA from an attack like this. No one knew at the time, but these kinds of sexual assaults were just beginning in this part of Southern California. Within months, investigators would realize this assault wasn't an isolated incident, but the beginning of a pattern. Just 2 months after the first reported assault, another woman in San Diego would experience almost the same exact nightmare. This time, the attack happened roughly 10 miles from the first crime scene, and it unfolded not on a jogging path, but inside the victim's very own home. The victim, identified as Jane Doe 2, had just returned home when she walked into her hallway and realized she wasn't alone. Standing there was a man she didn't know. Once again, you just can't imagine, unless you've been through something like this before, just how scary that must have been. You think you're alone and safe inside your own home, except one night you aren't. Even scarier, he matched the same general description given by the first victim, a large-built man wearing a ski mask holding a large kitchen knife. She later told police she was instantly shocked and terrified. But unlike what some might expect, she said the attacker himself appeared calm, controlled, deliberate, and fully in charge of the situation. Nothing about this situation looked like this was this guy's first rodeo. He had done something like this before, and he knew he could get away with it. During the assault, he didn't have a problem speaking directly to Jane Doe 2. He did things like point to his knife and say, "You see it?" Then warned her, "I will kill you if you don't do what I say." After making it very clear he wasn't messing around, he then ordered her to undress and sexually assaulted her inside her own home. When officers later spoke with Jane Doe 2, she gave a detailed account of what had happened. She said that during the attack, she was bound and gagged, unable to move or call for help. She said he ordered her to stay on the ground and threatened to kill her if she made any sound. And then, just as abruptly as he had appeared, he left. He walked straight out the front door. After he was gone, she managed to free herself. She ran to her living room and called police. Now here's an unfortunate reality. Almost immediately after the call was placed, her boyfriend arrived home. He had missed the attacker by just minutes. Had he shown up just minutes earlier, he might have been able to apprehend the guy. Or he might have become another victim. By the time the police arrived, the suspect was already long gone. But now, investigators were facing something they could no longer ignore. 2 attacks, 2 months apart. Similar descriptions, the same weapon, the same method of control. And once again, biological evidence was collected, carefully preserved, and added to a growing file that would eventually tell a much larger story. The third attack occurred on November 14th, 1995, just 1 month after the second assault, and once again, the pattern of the crime fit like a glove. The victim was inside her home when she heard some strange noises. At first, she assumed it might be her boyfriend coming home. They were at a point in their relationship where he had a key to her place. So nothing immediately felt out of place. But wanting to be sure, she looked out a window to check the driveway. If it really was her boyfriend, then she should have been able to see his car parked in the driveway. But when she looked out the window, his car wasn't there. When she turned back around, she realized she wasn't alone. The suspect was standing inside her living room. He immediately threatened her, telling her to be quiet or he would kill her. He then dragged her into a bedroom, forced her to the ground, and sexually assaulted her at knife point. Just like with the previous attack, the offender appeared calm, controlled, and deliberate. He wore gloves and a ski mask, concealing both his identity and any potential trace evidence. After the assault, he escaped. Investigators were never able to definitively determine how he left the home, but the doors had been locked, leading police to believe he may have entered and exited through a window. When San Diego officers arrived, they secured the scene and conducted the best search they could. They also canvassed the neighborhood, looking for anything out of the ordinary, discarded items, suspicious activity, or anyone who might have seen something out of place. But in the end, nothing was found. The victim told investigators that the knife used during the attack didn't appear to belong to her. So based on that detail and similar statements from other victims, police believed the offender brought the knife with him rather than grabbing one from inside the home. And this detail mattered. It suggested planning, preparation, and a willingness to escalate violence. By this point, San Diego investigators were no longer questioning what they were dealing with. This was a violent serial rapist, someone who was entering homes, threatening to kill his victims, and leaving behind little evidence beyond trauma and DNA. And despite their efforts, he was still unidentified. Just 3 days after the third assault, the perp was at it again. The fourth attack followed the same method investigators had already begun to recognize. As soon as the victim encountered the suspect, he immediately threatened her. Before she could say anything, he warned her that if she screamed, he would kill her. He dragged her into a bedroom and sexually assaulted her at knife point. There was no hesitation. The same control, the same weapon, the same escalation of violence. Investigators with the San Diego Police Department were confident all 4 assaults had been committed by the same person. But confidence wasn't enough. They needed confirmation. Biological evidence had been collected from each victim, and all of that evidence had been sent for forensic analysis. They also had semen samples that had been collected from the assaults compared against one another, and the results were undeniable. The DNA from all 4 crime scenes matched: one offender, multiple victims. As detectives reviewed the cases side by side, similarities went beyond the suspect's actions. The victims themselves also shared common traits. They were all young, most of them were blonde, and they were consistently described as attractive. So this wasn't just random opportunity alone, it was selection. This guy had a particular victim he searched for. He wasn't just attacking when he had the chance, he was choosing his victims deliberately. That realization raised immediate concern among investigators. It suggested fantasy, fixation, and a higher risk of continued violence. And with each attack happening closer together, one thing was becoming crystal clear. The offender was growing more confident, and he wasn't stopping. With DNA confirming a single suspect and a clear victim profile emerging, investigators knew they were racing against time. so they took the next logical step. The suspect's DNA profile was uploaded into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. At the time, CODIS was the primary tool law enforcement relied on to identify unknown offenders through DNA. If the attacker had been arrested before, if his DNA was already in the system, this could have ended everything. But when the results came back, there were no matches. The DNA didn't belong to anyone in the database. With no name and no immediate forensic lead, San Diego police shifted into prevention mode. They increased patrols in affected neighborhoods, set up roadblocks, expanded their presence in areas where the attacks had occurred. Undercover officers were deployed, hoping the suspect might return to the same locations or repeat familiar behavior. But none of that seemed to lead anywhere new. With so many options for weight loss treatment plans, it can be hard to know what's the best choice, who to trust, what to know about side effects, and if something's even going to work. That's why HERS offers access to doctor-developed treatment plans that are personalized to you. HERS goes beyond medication by offering access to ongoing care, dosage and medication adjustments, lifestyle and nutrition tips, and 24/7 support with no hidden costs or membership fees. And with options starting at just $69 per month with a 10-month plan when paid up front in full, HERS provides access to options that fit your goals and your budget. Feel like your best self again? Visit forhers.com/tales to get a personalized, affordable plan that gets you. That's forhers.com/tales for hers.com/tales. Weight loss by HERS is not available everywhere. Compounded drug products are not approved or evaluated for safety, effectiveness, or quality by the FDA. Prescription required. See website for full details, important safety information, and restrictions. Actual price depends on product and plan purchased. Therapy can help, but sometimes it isn't the whole answer. Talkiatry gives you access to real psychiatric care with licensed clinicians who can diagnose and prescribe medication if it's right for you. It's a simple way to get effective treatment right from home. And as a busy podcaster and mom myself, the convenience is so important. What's even better is that all their 600 plus clinicians are in network with major insurers, so you can use your existing insurance instead of paying monthly subscriptions or out-of-network fees. It's a 100% online psychiatry practice that provides comprehensive evaluations, diagnoses, and ongoing medication management for conditions like ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, PTSD, insomnia, and more. Head to talkiatry.com/tales and complete the short assessment to get matched with an in-network psychiatrist in just a few minutes. That's talkiatry.com/tales to get matched in minutes. Within the San Diego Police Department, the sex crimes unit was placed on high alert. Detectives began re-examining reports, descriptions, timelines. They searched for anything that might have been overlooked. They also started considering potential offender pools. Because of San Diego's large military presence, investigators explored whether the suspect could be active duty or recently discharged military. And here's why. The suspect was consistently described as physically fit, controlled, calm under pressure. At the time, investigators believed those traits could align with military training. But despite interviews, background checks, and incoming tips, no solid leads emerged. And then, without warning, the attack stopped. For the next 7 years, there were no known assaults attributed to the Knifepoint Rapist. No arrests, no new DNA hits, no explanation for why the attack suddenly stopped. By 2002, the Knifepoint Rapist investigation was officially considered cold. The DNA profile still existed in CODIS, but it had never produced a name. But just when you think this might be the end of the story, there was another attack. This time, it happened in Northeast San Diego. The victim had just finished putting her young daughter to bed, and as she stepped out of the bedroom and into the hallway, she came face to face with a man standing there, waiting. And as you've probably already guessed, he threatened her immediately. During the assault, he told her that if she didn't comply, he would harm her daughter. So faced with that threat, she did what she believed she had to do to keep her child safe. Afterward, the suspect issued another warning. He told her not to call police and said that if she did, he would return to attack both her and her daughter, but she didn't listen. As soon as he was gone, she contacted the authorities. As with the earlier cases, biological evidence was collected and processed, and the DNA profile was uploaded into CODIS. This time, the system returned a result. The DNA matched the profile from the 4 assaults committed in 1995. The same offender had returned. But once again, they couldn't identify a name. All they knew was that this was 5 attacks, 1 DNA profile, and a very, very violent man living among them for nearly a decade. 2 years later, in November of 2004, the offender struck again, this time outside San Diego. It happened in Palm Desert in nearby Riverside County. The victim had just returned home from her boyfriend's house. When she got inside, her daughter was already there, and the house seemed completely empty until it wasn't. Within what must have felt like seconds, she was confronted by a man. And everything that followed next is taken straight out of the storyline we've already heard. The suspect was calm, composed. He never raised his voice at the victim. Instead, he focused on control. He made sure the victim saw the knife, just as previous victims had described, and sexually assaulted her at knife point. The behavior matched the earlier cases almost exactly. Once again, biological evidence was collected and analyzed, and when the DNA was entered into CODIS, it matched the same unidentified profile tied to the San Diego assaults. By now, investigators knew something else too. They were running out of time. Not just because they were afraid of more victims, but because of something else. California's statute of limitations for rape was just 10 years. This is the amount of time prosecutors have under the law to file criminal charges against someone. That meant the assaults from 1995, the very first attacks in San Diego, were dangerously close to aging out. If prosecutors couldn't identify the suspect before that deadline passed, he could never be charged for those crimes, even with DNA, even with multiple victims. So that's when prosecutors got creative and found a workaround for the state's statute of limitations laws. Instead of waiting for a name, the district attorney's office filed a criminal complaint against the DNA profile itself. Not a person, not a suspect, just the DNA. This legal move essentially stopped the clock. It allowed prosecutors to prosecute the earlier assaults once the offender was identified, whenever that might happen. Otherwise, those earlier victims would never see justice. When and if the guy was caught, their cases wouldn't be allowed to move forward in the system because it had been past 10 years. So this was a very important move in order to protect the victims' rights and make sure they get the justice they deserve. I don't think there's been any other case we've covered on the show before where prosecutors have done that. File a criminal complaint against a DNA profile, not a name. So it was definitely an unusual and bold strategy. And as it turned out, a very smart one. Because even though investigators still didn't know who this man was, they had now ensured he wouldn't escape justice simply by outlasting the calendar. For the next several years, San Diego investigators had done everything they could with the tools available to them. But no luck catching the man now known as the Knifepoint Rapist. But that began to change after a major breakthrough in another California case. In 2018, law enforcement announced the arrest of the Golden State Killer suspect, a case that had remained unsolved for more than 4 decades. What finally cracked it wasn't a traditional database search. It was forensic genetic genealogy. So San Diego investigators took notice. Detectives began learning how the Golden State Killer investigation had unfolded and reached out to people who had worked directly on that case, including those who had collaborated with the FBI. And after just one phone call together, those experts agreed to help apply the same approach to the Knifepoint Rapist case. It was the first real sense of momentum investigators had felt in years. Up to this point, investigators had solely relied on CODIS. But CODIS only works if a suspect's DNA is already in the system, usually because they've been arrested or convicted before. Forensic genetic genealogy works differently. Instead of looking for an exact match, investigators analyze single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, tiny genetic markers spread across a person's DNA. San Diego police sent the suspect's DNA to a private laboratory, gene by gene, where technicians developed a SNP profile suitable for genealogical searching. That profile could then be uploaded to public genealogy databases that allow law enforcement access. The goal wasn't to find the suspect himself, it was to find his relatives. From there, genealogists could begin building family trees, working backward through generations, narrowing down branches based on age, location, and other known details from the case. Once gene by gene completed the SNP profile, investigators took the next step. That profile was uploaded to multiple genealogy databases that allow law enforcement use, and almost immediately the DNA began producing results. The matches were distant: second cousins, third cousins, people who shared enough DNA to indicate a family connection, but not enough to identify the suspect outright. Forensic genealogists spent hours, then days, then weeks, building out family trees by hand. They traced branches forward and backward through generations, marriages, children, relocations, slowly connecting dots between relatives who had never imagined their DNA might one day help solve a violent crime. And as the trees grew, patterns began to emerge. Multiple distant matches pointed back to the same ancestral lines. And when those lines were cross-referenced with known details from the case, geography, age range, and timing, the suspect pool began to shrink. Eventually, investigators were no longer looking at dozens of families. They were looking at just a few. And then the focus narrowed again. The genealogical work ultimately pointed to two brothers living in Palm Springs, California, a location that immediately stood out given the Palm Desert assault years earlier. One family name rose to the top: Van Buskirk. For the first time since 1995, investigators weren't just chasing a DNA profile. They had people to look at. Once investigators identified the two Van Buskirk brothers, the next step was to compare both of them side by side. Which brother would be more likely to have committed such horrible, violent crimes? And almost instantly, they had the answer to that question. The brothers lived very different lives. One was described as a devoted family man, deeply religious, settled, and consistent in his routines. Nothing in his background or behavior aligned with the offender investigators had been tracking for years. The other brother stood out. He lived a far more transient lifestyle, moving around more frequently. He had been married and had a child. On the surface, he appeared to be living a normal life. But the more investigators looked, the more details began to align with the case. Police reviewed publicly available information, including wedding photos and social media posts. And what stood out wasn't just his appearance. It was his wife. Investigators thought that she closely resembled the victims described in the earlier assaults: young, blonde, and physically similar to the women the offender had targeted years earlier. The San Diego authorities focused all of their attention on Christopher Van Buskirk. But suspicion wasn't enough. To move forward, police needed one final piece of proof. They needed his DNA. By the time investigators had zeroed in on Christopher Van Buskirk, he was living hundreds of miles away from Southern California and Arizona. That meant San Diego detectives couldn't do this alone. They needed to coordinate with local Arizona law enforcement and federal authorities to begin surveillance. Everything had to be done carefully. Investigators needed a DNA sample, but it had to be collected legally without tipping him off. They quickly learned Van Buskirk was working as a manager at a restaurant, so police went in the same way any other customers would. Undercover officers sat down, ordered food, and blended in. And when Van Buskirk took his lunch break, one officer casually struck up a conversation with him. Just small talk. Normal conversation between two people sharing a table. The restaurant had bar-style seating, which meant another agent working with the FBI was sitting directly across from him. Eventually, Van Buskirk finished his meal and got up to return to work. And after he left, agents moved in. They collected a fork from his plate, an item he had used during the meal, and sent it immediately for DNA testing. And the waiting didn't take long. Just 2 hours later, the lab called back with the results. The DNA profile from the fork was a match to the unknown suspect profile tied to the San Diego and Riverside assaults. After nearly 3 decades, investigators finally had their answer. It was him, Christopher Van Buskirk. Police in Southern California obtained an arrest warrant, while police in Arizona got their own search warrant to be able to search Van Buskirk's home. The plan was for San Diego detectives to travel out and coordinate directly with local law enforcement. So officers from both agencies arranged to meet in Phoenix. But when they arrived, Van Buskirk wasn't there. So they came up with a different plan. Van Buskirk had previously been listed as a witness in an unrelated fraud case. So using that connection, law enforcement created a ruse, contacting him under the pretense of following up on that earlier matter. He was told they wanted to meet with him and have him look at some suspect photos. And he agreed. And he showed up. When Van Buskirk arrived at the meeting location, officers moved in. He was taken into custody at gunpoint and arrested without incident. He didn't ask questions. He didn't resist. He didn't even seem surprised. I think at this point, the police knew they had the right guy. Following the arrest, he was brought down to the police station in Phoenix to be questioned. But instead of cooperating, he invoked his right to an attorney and chose not to answer any questions. From there, he was extradited back to San Diego, where the original cases had begun nearly 3 decades earlier. One of the first priorities for investigators and prosecutors was notifying the victims. Each woman was told that the man responsible for their assaults had finally been identified and taken into custody. Prosecutors charged Van Buskirk with forcible rape in all of the known cases. And given the number of victims, the violent nature of the assaults, and the DNA evidence linking them together, the charges carried the possibility of a life sentence. This was a case built almost entirely on forensic evidence, DNA preserved for decades, finally given meaning through genetic genealogy. Ultimately, Christopher Van Buskirk chose to plead guilty. He entered guilty pleas in all 6 cases, resulting in a sentence of 50 years to life in prison. No trial, no cross-examination of survivors, no need for the victims to relive what had happened to them in a courtroom. After nearly 30 years, the case was finally closed. When Christopher Van Buskirk pled guilty, he was 47 years old, so a sentence of 50 years to life was effectively a life sentence. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars for what he did to those women. What makes this case stand out isn't just the outcome. It's how long justice waited for the tools to catch up. The DNA that identified him had been collected decades earlier. It sat preserved, unchanged, waiting for a method that didn't exist yet. Forensic genetic genealogy didn't rewrite the evidence. It didn't reinterpret it. It simply gave it a voice. This case is a reminder that time does not erase truth. Evidence matters. Preservation matters. And even when years pass without answers, science continues to evolve. For the survivors, accountability came late, but it came. And for forensic science, this case stands as another example of how the past can still be solved when we're willing to keep looking.
Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.